Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Marius Roodt. Marius, how are you?
How's it, Nick? Going all right on yourself?
It is going all right, this side. And Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, are you surviving in this difficult and wild, wacky world we live in?
Getting by, Nicholas, getting by.
That's always good. Right. So let's start off. We have, of course, been following the story in Glencoe, and we're not going to do a full segment on it today, but there has been a little development. Terence, what's happened?
Well, the current leg of the story, if I can put it like that, is the question of bail, and the decision has just come back from the magistrate that Mr. Simpson will be denied bail on the grounds that he didn't show any exceptional circumstances. His age and his health are apparently not regarded by the court as exceptional. So it seems that he will be held in custody unless there is some avenue to challenge this decision. And we are trying to get in touch with people on the ground. But this is what we know so far. The decision came through this morning.
Interesting. Anyway, we'll keep an eye on that. Seems a bit of a strange decision, but anyway. All right, let us go on to our first story, and this is that it's another one of these wild and wacky law and order stories in South Africa. There is a story on, I think it was Eyewitness News, that according to a local member of the Community Police Forum, people in Mamelodi are praising a vigilante who is being called on social media John Wick. He is this. It's not clear whether such a person exists, but in the last 12 days, there's been killings of members of a gang called Boko Haram, which is active in Mamelodi. It's always a good thing when a gang calls itself after a terrorist group. And apparently at least 7 people have been killed by this vigilante, and there's been a wounding of one other. And he has been praised on social media by members of the Mamelodi community, saying that he is stepping up to the plate and dealing with the gangsters in the town and all that kind of thing. Anyway, the police, as they are supposed to say, that they are investigating exactly what's going on here. It's not clear, by the way, that such a person does exist. It could always be the case that these are different killings that are being attributed to one person. Maybe there is someone, I don't know. Still, this is exactly what happens when the door is left open by the police. You get dudes running around shooting people. I have a feeling the story is not going to end terribly well. Not that it's gone well so far. I mean, 8 people have died. Marius, what do you make of this story? I mean, it doesn't seem like it's particularly good news to me.
No, and it's. I think I might have mentioned on the show before. It's part of the general breakdown in law and order in South Africa, I think. I've just been busy working on the 4th report in our Broken Blue Line project. And for the first time, we included incidents of vigilantism in it. And sorry if there's just the background noise there, but when I was doing the reports, so many of the people who were involved in these vigilante incidents, not necessarily people who were actually committing the vigilantism, they were the people who like talking about what had been happening, and they said, look, you hear about a guy who got burnt to death for stealing a cell phone or something, and people were saying, they don't necessarily condone it, but the cops never come to that area, or if they do come, they just take a statement and they don't come investigate. And lots of these places, I mean, generally lower income areas or informal settlements and stuff, there's a reign of terror of gangsters and people, and often younger guys, young men who are drug addicts or whatever the case is. But I mean, that's part of it. There's no jobs for people. They fall into bad habits or into criminal gangs and what have you. And if there's an outlet for people through work or through education, whatever the case is, this probably wouldn't happen. So it's part of a broader societal issue, I think. There's a lack of law and order and so on. There's a lack of things for young men especially to go do. And in any country, it's been studied a lot in Africa. Africa has a problem of a lot of young men who aren't in education or aren't employed, and there is a correlation between that and instability in a country. And I think that's what we're seeing here. And obviously, I mean, this John Wick fellow, you can't condone what's happening, but if a community feels like they're under siege, this kind of thing will happen, and it'll probably become more and more common. And we already see it, as I say. Every week we hear about a vigilante incident where people were, I mean, ranges from petty crimes like, as I said, a cell phone thief getting killed, to more, more serious crimes. People get, they catch somebody who they suspect of being a rapist or murderer, and they kill the guy. Obviously you can't condone it, but when these communities feel like they don't have any other choice, this kind of thing that happens.
Right, it's quite interesting here that the name that the community is referring to the vigilante by on social media is John Wick, who is, of course, a character played by Keanu Reeves in some action movies, which are very similar. Marius, I think you've got a plane flying over you very low. Anyway. So, Terence, what do you make of this? It kind of seems like people in these places are in an impossible position. The police are absent, but at the same, and gangs are running around, but at the same time, you just can't accept it when people are running around taking the law to their own hands and killing people without trial.
Well, this is there's sort of an echo of the Phoenix situation that was all in the news a couple of weeks ago, where people do not feel that the state is performing its obligations. They'll take that upon themselves, and these things, as the saying goes, can so easily get out of hand. But yeah, I think that it was that TV series Arrow, where this guy comes back from his experience of growing up on an island. He discovers that the city's gone to hell, and he's going to become a vigilante. And I remember looking at that and saying, well, this if only our cities looked quite that nice and our vigilantes were quite that sophisticated. Credibility is something that has to be continuously reestablished, and I think on so many issues the state has simply dropped the ball. So I was quite tickled when dark arrowish way. I was tickled when President Ramaphosa said, we won't tolerate vigilantism. Well, you can tolerate it or you can not tolerate it, but you're really powerless to prevent it, and you will only dissuade it by when people feel safe, which the state has neither the capacity nor, I'd say, any real interest in doing.
Exactly. This does also remind me of a case in so New York in the 1970s was a city that was plagued by very terrible levels of crime. And I believe there was a widely publicized case at the time of a vigilante who hung around on subway cars and then shot muggers. And eventually he was caught, I think. But they actually made some movies about this, and it became sort of almost like a rallying cry for people in New York who were angered by this. The Death Wish series was actually, I think, originally based off of this story. So the stuff, I think, is quite powerful in the way that it can motivate people. And it's, like you guys have said, it's a sign that things are not going so well right now with our law and order. Anything final to say, Marius, before we go on?
I know there was a vigilante incident, not sure if it's quite the same one you talk about in New York, where a guy, I can't remember exactly what he did, but he made himself, to be attractive to criminals. And he was sitting in a subway car, and 3 or 4 guys came up to him, pulled a knife on him. He took out his gun, he shot the guys. And apparently what actually sunk him at the end is he shot the guys that were all writhing around in pain. And he said to one guy, looks like you need another. And he shot the guy while he was lying on the floor. And that's actually what got the guy into trouble in the end. And that's what he got. I think he actually went to jail for a bit because of that. But I think that's in any, as you say, New York was basically Mad Max world. It was probably, if you took a Joburger from now to New York.
Joburg on a sunny day.
Yeah, you think, yes, this is such a nice, peaceful city. Jeez, like what's going on here? What they're complaining about? But I think in any society, like we're saying, like when law and order starts breaking down, people start taking it into their own hands, and that is not good for the social fabric or the country as a whole.
Indeed. Anyway, let's move on to our next story, and that is that a a figure who's kind of, I don't know, he's not quite at the top of the news in South Africa. He's not one of our big political figures, but of course he is kind of in the upper echelons, and that is because he is a grandson of former President Nelson Mandela, and this is of course Mandla Mandela, who is also the chief of the Mvezo Traditional Council and plays a big role in the House of Traditional Leaders, which is a body that we don't actually hear much about, but it's actually quite important in South Africa in terms of, well, if you listen to how the ANC talks about it. He has recently on Instagram declared that the Miss Universe contest and the newly crowned Miss South Africa must boycott the upcoming event because it is going to be held in Israel. So, of course, the Miss Universe pageant is held in countries around the world. It moves around, and apparently this time it's going to be held in, I think it's Eilat, which is on the Israeli coast. He said, that Israel was an apartheid occupying state, and that there was nothing beautiful about occupation, brutality, and institutionalized discrimination against the Palestinian people. He also said the brutal punishment and harassment meted out to Palestinians on a daily basis is horrific, detestable, and a crime against humanity that must be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. So, Terence, let me go to you on this one. I'm always interested. So, firstly, I guess we can talk about the sort of boycott campaign against Israel around the world, but also I'm always interested in about how beauty contests attract a surprising amount of political attention. What do you make of this story?
Well, yeah. Not only that, they also make great fodder for movies. Remember Miss Congeniality. Mandla Mandela seems, strikes me as somebody who really does enjoy trading off his family name, and he seems to have found a niche in the BDS milieu. Yeah, of course, entitled it to his view, but I think it's an example of this peculiar obsession with Israel. Israel is one, the Israeli-Palestine conflict is one of a number of territorial disputes around the world, some of which are conducted with, if anything, more ferocity than the Israelis do by good friends of ours, like the Chinese, and spend an afternoon in Xinjiang, and we can discuss that. I think, at the end of the day, though, for most of the world, Israel is another country with its challenges, and an international beauty pageant is a lot more about showcasing budding careers in the world of PR, or fashion modeling, or being a spokesperson for a philanthropy. Interestingly, a couple of years ago, I remember reading about, I don't know if it was the Miss Universe or if it was one of the competitors, but apparently there was a contestant from Iraq who latched on to the contestant from Israel because I think they could both speak Arabic, and this was all that I must say, very beautiful Iraqi lady was able to do. Anyway, apparently she got she got a great deal of hate when she got home, presumably by people who wouldn't have been overly thrilled about the whole purpose of a beauty pageant anyway.
Yeah, I think she. I followed her for a while on social media. I think she actually fled Iraq in the end, and she now is sort of a ambassador for better relations between the Arab world and Israel.
Well, good for her. Look, but on the whole question of Israel and Palestine, just an off-the-cuff thought. It seems to me that breaking off relations, cold shouldering Israel, etc., didn't do very much to bring about Palestinian statehood in the 40 to 60 years that it was practiced. Maybe it's time to try something else.
Indeed. Marius, what do you make of this? It's interesting also how it continues to make its way back into South African politics, even though it really is something that we are not really anything of a major player in.
I think firstly we should not listen to what Mandla Mandela says. He's not exactly, one of South Africa's great thinkers. In 2015, he was convicted of assault. I also remember, I think he was an MP for the ANC for a while. As I recall, he threatened somebody in Parliament with assault. I can't remember if it was an EFF MP or who it was. Not much decorum. And he also converted to Islam a little while ago, which there's obviously no problem with that. But he's also a chief in the Eastern Cape, and the people who are living on his land, he acted like a feudal lord. He said now because he's converted to Islam, people aren't allowed to sell alcohol on his land anymore. And for a lot of people, that is their single source of income. They're running little shebeens or bottle stores or taverns or whatever the case is. And now he just says, no, sorry, you can't do this anymore, which you've been doing for however long. It's your only source of income, and I'm going to stop you doing it. So he doesn't, because of his religion, not because, and in South Africa, we have freedom of religion. You can be whatever religion you want, but you can't interfere in other people's business. And I think that was a bit of a problem. So I think we should, Mandla Mandela, the only reason people are taking notice of him is because of his surname. And I think Terence is completely correct. He trades off his surname. And we also saw, I don't know if the listeners and viewers recall, there was a show called Being Mandela that came out around about a decade ago. And it was Nelson Mandela's granddaughters. And it was one of the most crass shows and crass displays of conspicuous consumption I've ever seen in my life. If I don't know if it was the editing that made these people look bad or if they were just really nasty people. Made me think, Jesse, poor Nelson Mandela. His grandkids weren't really doing much for the Mandela name. But be that as it may, this does seem. I think things like beauty pageants are probably. They seem a bit of an anachronism at the moment. So I don't know if they're going to be around for much longer. We've already seen people saying, it's demeaning to women. It's also focusing on the looks and so on. For me, if a woman wants to take part in one of these kind of competitions and wants to be judged on her looks, that's fine by me. I also think beauty pageants are a bit, bit of a silly thing. But
that's just because no one wants to pay to look at you.
Yeah,
or me for that matter, because the shirt makes me look fat.
Yeah, so as usual,
when are we going to have the Daily Friend beauty contest?
Yeah, exactly. And just the usual. If countries want to boycott Israel, go ahead and boycott them if they want. There's many other places that should also be boycotted, in my opinion. But the Israel-Palestine issue, that's not something I want to get into because I think it's very complicated, and I think both sides aren't exactly covering themselves in glory on that. But I think maybe it should be up to each individual person who's representing their country. If they feel comfortable going to represent their country in Israel, if they do so, then they must go. If they don't, then they must maybe take a step back and let their, each country then maybe send a replacement or whatever the case is. So and it's also kind of complicated. No offense to these women who are taking part in the pageant, but I doubt many of them are politics on international relations or geopolitics, and they're going to be shoved into the spotlight and get asked for their opinion on Israel and what's happening in the West Bank.
I'm reminded of that clip from, I think it was the early 2000s, of a certain contestant, Miss Carolina, who was in an American beauty contest, and she she was asked a question about improving education around the world, and her answer was so incoherent it became one of those early viral videos.
I remember that.
All right, let us move.
Look, if I was one of those ladies, I'd just say, "You jealous? You don't look like me."
There we go. All right, let us move on to our next story, and it's not a particularly unique story. In fact, I think in the run-up to elections, we always get a huge number of them. But it is kind of emblematic of the place that South Africa finds itself when it comes to politics. And this is, of course, a community in the Western Cape, members of a township called Masiphumelele, which is, I think, by Fishhook, have said that as the government has not replaced houses of theirs that were burned down recently, and they haven't heard anything. They think that they're only going to get houses in 2023, that they're not going to vote in this election. Now, unlike a lot of these stories, this is actually a DA ward, and the ward councillor is sort of quoted here about talking about where the process is. But I think that's neither here nor there for this story, in that this is fairly typical of how, as our data shows, most South Africans look at elections. Rather than maybe using their vote powerfully to change whoever they might live under, to change their government, they prefer to just not vote. And this is held out as a sort of great threat to whoever's in charge. But if you actually look at the electoral dynamics of this ward, and indeed almost every ward where people just don't vote, it almost always benefits whoever's already currently running the ward. Marius, what do you make of this?
Yeah, it's something. It's a phenomenon we've seen before. Before every election, you'll hear about a service delivery protest, and the people in the community will say, "This time we're not going to vote." And I think that's changing. And I think as South Africa's democracy matures, we'll see, or hopefully, I mean, we have a very large number of people who don't vote. I think actually in 2019, more people
they were the
didn't vote
largest
than
block
actually
of
voted.
people. Right, exactly.
So, but there have been, I know people in the DA have spoken about this. People who are normally ANC voters, it takes them a while to change their vote away from ANC, and they'll normally abstain for an election or two before they can bring themselves to vote for a party other than the ANC. But I mean, this is quite interesting. As you say, this is a DA ward, and I mean, at the risk of stereotyping, I would assume that most people in the Mamelodi area don't vote for the DA. And the DA didn't win the DA got about 60% of the votes in that ward in 2016, or 59%, and the ANC got 35%. So, it's a fairly safe DA ward, but also not a slam dunk for the DA. And if, people in Mamelodi do come out to vote, could maybe make the ward a bit more competitive, and who knows, take it away from the DA. And I think that's one thing people need to realize. I think I've mentioned in the show as well. The ANC does sometimes actually react to electoral pressure. And I think the same will probably be true of the DA. If the DA is not going to lose Cape Town in 2021, but I do think they're going to see the majority shrink. But I mean, they won the Cape Town by, I think they got nearly 70% of the votes in 2016 in Cape Town. I think it's likely they'll see a decline in that vote. But I do think if the DA does see that there's a big chunk of support leaving them for, perhaps Good or other parties, we might see, change in the DA might have to change tactics, whatever the case is. So I think that's and people. I think it's very dangerous if people do lose their faith in the electoral process in South Africa, and that's an issue that can also lead to problems down the line. If people feel that the only way change can come is through, violent protest or other means rather than at the ballot box, it's not going to be good news for South Africa.
Not good news for South Africa at all.
Terence, what do you make of the phenomenon of not voting? I think one of the interesting things is it shows how, while the ANC has not necessarily been that good in convincing people to back it, super enthusiastically, as we know now from the number of people who don't vote, it's done a very good job of demonizing the opposition or convincing people that the opposition is just not worth voting for.
Yeah, I think that a lot of our politics follows a model that's almost like a family, rather than a sort of conditional democratic support. There's an interesting phrase that you certainly used to hear it a lot, probably not so much anymore. People saying, I am ANC. Not I support the ANC or I vote for the ANC, but to say I am ANC means that your being is sort of bound up with the identity of the party. I remember hearing Helen Zille speak about this, must have been about 10 years ago at a public meeting, and she said that she had purposefully established an office in Khayelitsha so that she could work with predominantly African communities, non-DA supporters in the main, and she said that she had built up a network of people who seemed very sympathetic and whom she had tried to help. And at the end of as elections approached, she phoned them and she asked if they'd consider voting for the DA. And apparently the university said no. Said no, Helen, we love you. We're very grateful for everything you've done for us. Nobody in the ANC, has shown your level of commitment to our community. But we are ANC. We can't escape it. It's like something that is built into who we are. And we have to give our votes to the ANC. I think until that is broken, and the possibilities of using the ballot box to change your circumstances, to demand accountability. I mean, because that's essentially what it is. You entrust somebody to represent you, and you are free to withdraw that trust at the next election. Until we all understand that.
To be fair, I think that's a phenomenon around the world. I remember reading that was about Afrikaner attitudes, Afrikaner political attitudes in the 1980s. And there was a large proportion of Afrikaners who said they would vote for the National Party even if they disagreed with the policies of the party. And I think for a lot of Afrikaners between, from 1940s, 50s, coming up to 1980s, the National Party was in some ways almost how the ANC is to many people in this country. It liberated them in inverted commas. But this is a phenomenon you get all over the world. We see, the constituencies in the UK, especially in the north of England, who have voted Labour for 100 years. I mean, we saw some changes in 2019 where the so-called Red Wall, a lot of those constituencies voted for the Tories. But it's places where people have voted for Labour because their father voted for Labour, because their grandfather voted for Labour, and because their grandfather used to work on the mines, even though this person now will be, a barista or will be working in an office job and won't be considered working class except for the most broad use of the term. But they are a Labour person because their family is Labour. And this is, I'm sure you get similar phenomena in most democracies around the world.
Oh no! Well, I heard an amusing personal anecdote about that some years ago. A guy talking about his experience as a British immigrant in South Africa in the 80s, and said that his dad was a rock solid member of the Labour Party. What was socialists doing coming to a party in South Africa? And he said, well, actually, the point about our family's politics was my dad voted Labour because his father had, and my mom voted Labour because my dad did.
It reminded me of there was a story recently, I think, on Times Live of an old lady who declared her support after she met Ramaphosa. She declared her support for the ANC. But the quote from her that really struck me was, she said, voting for a different political party than the one you are, part of, is like changing churches and hoping to find Jesus there. And I think that really kind of explains it, right? It's tied to identity and belief in a very serious way. And this, as you guys point out, this is not unique to South Africa, but perhaps it's worse here than it is in other places.
I think it creates it creates a problem in South Africa, whether that's unique or not. And that it really is deadly for democracy, as every failed democracy will tell you. If the ballot box isn't used effectively, what comes to replace it might not be so good. Precisely.
Real democracy has been tried yet, Nick.
It just has a habit of doing very well for a long time and then getting bored with itself and deciding to commit suicide.
I think there are two brilliant quotes from Winston Churchill. I don't know if they're apocryphal or if they're true. He allegedly said, democracy is a terrible system. That's the best out of all the ones we've tried. But he also said the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. So,
well, I think that one thing about the past decade or so is that the ideological challenge particularly of China, but there are other bits and pieces who contribute to this, that you don't need democracy. What you need is a strong state that kind of puts everyone in their place and does for people what they need to be done for them, is very, very attractive. In fact, I had a most interesting conversation with a former very prominent journalist who was sort of an anti-apartheid crusader. He said, let's face it, democracy has failed. We need a kind of Chinese solution. And I said, well, you might have ended up joining Nelson on the island at that point.
Anyway,
But there are strange things in this world. Eh?
No, I can't. Anyway, let's close it before I go completely mad. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show. Hope you found it interesting. We will, of course, be back next week for another episode of the Daily Friend Show. And everyone must have a most excellent and spectacular weekend. I'm sure you're going to see the political parties out and about because we are very close to an election, less than 2 weeks. Anyway, have a wonderful day, everyone, and we'll see you next week on the Daily Friend Show.